A child was locked underground for years. No one taught him to speak, and no one cared if he died. This is the story of Darth Nox, the Sith who should not exist. He was born in one of the storage cells beneath the Sith Academy on Korriban, a place built for the forgotten, not for warriors, not for students, but for the discarded. No records, no history, just a cell, a number, and the cold. There were others, children from broken worlds, survivors of planets that no longer had names, left in cages with rotted blankets and iron bowls, not to be raised, not to be trained, but to be forgotten. If they starved, it didn't matter. If they lived, maybe someone would decide what to do with them later. Most screamed when the doors closed. Some begged, others cried themselves to sleep. But not him. He was silent, not because he was strong, but because silence was the only thing that kept him alive. The guards ignored the quiet ones. The cruel ones tormented the weak, not the still. So he waited. Still, cold, listening. He learned to move without sound, to breathe without drawing breath too loudly, to hide his food, to close his eyes when others were taken. He never asked where they went, because he already knew. The Force was never explained to him. No one gave him a name for the feeling that stirred in his blood when danger approached. But it was there, in the silence, in the stillness. Like a pressure behind his eyes, it warned him when to lie still, when to hide, when to strike. Sometimes he obeyed it. Sometimes it moved his body before he even thought. The children changed. The loud ones vanished. The violent ones bled. The ones who cried for their parents stopped crying after a while. Some starved. Some froze. Some simply stopped waking up. But not him. He didn't grow. He hardened, like something buried under stone. He forgot what sunlight looked like. Forgot what a voice sounded like. His own voice, never used, began to vanish. He became a shadow in the back of the room, never sleeping, never speaking, watching. Some began to fear him, not because of what he did, but because nothing ever seemed to touch him. The cold didn't shake him. The guards didn't beat him. Hunger didn't weaken him. They whispered that he was cursed, or dead, or worse, waiting. They were right. One day, the steel door opened. Blinding light poured through. A silhouette appeared in the doorway, not kind, not curious, just tired and cruel. "You, acolyte." The boy didn't move, not at first. It had been so long since he stood. "Get up," the voice snapped. He obeyed, slow, silent. His legs trembled but held. He didn't know what they wanted. He didn't care. He was no longer waiting to be rescued, no longer dreaming of warmth or freedom. He had become something else. Not a child, not a slave, but the silence itself. The halls above him were louder than he expected. After so many years underground, the shift was overwhelming. Footsteps echoed like thunder. Voices snapped like whips. The air no longer smelled like stone and rust, it smelled like blood, sweat, and smoke. The Sith Academy was alive in the worst possible way. It pulsed with cruelty. No one looked at him. He was dragged through the training complex like luggage. The guards didn't speak. The other acolytes didn't ask who he was. To them, he was just another body to test. Another child from the lower cells. And most of those didn't last long. They gave him no name, no rank, just a tattered robe and a schedule, if it could even be called that. It wasn't training, it was weeding. Every morning began with violence. Not lessons, not lectures, just punishment. If someone fell behind, they were beaten. If someone asked a question, they were mocked. If someone hesitated, even for a second, they were dragged away, and they never came back. The instructors didn't care if you understood. They only cared if you obeyed. He did. But not in the way they expected. He didn't lash out like the others, didn't posture or bark like the ones who had something to prove. He simply followed orders, struck when told, blocked when needed, said nothing when blood ran down his arms. That same silence followed him here, and it unsettled them. Even in a place where cruelty was currency, his stillness made others nervous. One acolyte tried to humiliate him on the dueling floor, laughed in his face, called him broken, half dead. A creature, not a person. The fight didn't last long. He didn't roar or scream. He just moved fast, efficient, and without hesitation. The other boy hit the ground before he realized he'd lost. He lay there, gasping for air while the instructors said nothing. They didn't praise. They didn't punish. They simply moved on. But now, the others were watching. They had seen how he fought, how calm his face stayed, how he didn't gloat, didn't feed on applause, as if violence was just routine. It wasn't power they saw in him. It was emptiness. And the Force responded to that. Every night in the barracks he dreamed of voices, not his own, not memories, but whispers old and cold. He would wake in silence, covered in sweat, heart still as stone. Sometimes he'd see things before they happened, a duel that hadn't begun, a corridor not yet crossed, a body lying still in the shadows hours before the blow was struck. And when those moments came true, he didn't react. He already knew he was different. He just didn't know how much. He started spending more time alone, not to hide, but to listen. Korriban was loud in ways others didn't hear. There were echoes in the walls, pulls in the dust. The tombs that lay beyond the academy's edges, ancient and sealed, called to something inside him. Not with language, with gravity. He would stand near the edge of the excavation sites, staring into the cracks that led down to older things, forgotten things. He didn't understand them, but he felt them. As if something beneath the stone was watching him, the way he had once watched others in the dark. And slowly, something began to change. The others avoided him now, not just because he was quiet, but because the force around him felt colder, tighter, like a noose that hadn't yet been pulled. He had not yet taken a life, but it was only a matter of time. And when that time came, they would not see it coming, because he would not raise his voice. He never had to. The Sith didn't teach with knowledge. They taught with pain. Lessons weren't written on datapads. They were carved into the skin, into the bone, into the memory of every acolyte who survived the first month. Most didn't. Some left in stretchers. Some were buried in shallow graves near the canyon edge. Others simply vanished between trials, unspoken and unnamed. There were no funerals, no mourning. Only fewer beds the next day. He noticed quickly that fear wasn't discouraged here. It was rewarded as long as it wasn't your own. Instructors beat students with training sabers, burned them with shock collars, forced them to duel each other with dull blades until one collapsed. But the cruelest were the students themselves. Sith acolytes weren't brothers. They weren't comrades. They were obstacles. And every day was a new test of who would step over whom to survive. He adapted faster than the others, not because he was smarter, not because he was stronger, but because he had no need to unlearn mercy. He had never been taught it in the first place. When one acolyte broke his ribs during a sparring match, he didn't cry out, he simply fell. And when the instructor turned away, he stood again, quiet, bleeding, but standing. The boy who had struck him looked back in disbelief, expecting revenge, expecting rage. But none came. Only a stare, cold, patient. That night, the acolyte who broke his ribs choked to death in his sleep. They said it was poison. They said it was sabotage. He said nothing. The next day, he was moved to a new training cohort. Fewer students, harsher trials. More eyes on him. They began to notice the way he absorbed pain. The way he didn't flinch when shocked. The way his strikes never wasted movement. How his opponents bled before they realized he'd drawn his blade. He wasn't passionate. He wasn't angry. He was surgical. And the Sith Lords watching from the high balconies, the ones who never spoke, began to take interest. They didn't care who he was, only what he might become. In time, he was selected for specialized field trials, missions outside the academy walls. Some were infiltration, some were assassination. Most were lies, designed to break the minds of the weak. But he didn't break. On one mission, he was ordered to kill a Republic sympathizer's family to prove loyalty. Others hesitated. He did not. He obeyed without question, without pause, without cruelty. Not because he enjoyed it, but because it was required. And that terrified the instructors more than anything. He didn't revel in death. He simply moved through it, untouched. They sent him to a Jedi ruin on Korriban's far side, an old battlefield still soaked in Force echoes. Others who went there came back shaking, haunted, unstable. He came back unchanged. But that wasn't the truth. He had heard something in the silence there, felt something beneath the stones. Whispers, not from ghosts, but from deeper things, older things. The kind of presence that didn't speak in words, but in pressure behind the eyes, cold hands around the soul. The Force wasn't light or dark to him. It was a shadow, and it moved with him now. He began to feel it, even when he wasn't reaching. When he breathed, when he fought, when he dreamed. Especially when he dreamed. There were images now not his own. Sith Lords long dead, rituals buried in sand, names that burned his tongue when he woke up. He started keeping them to himself. Because he had learned the most important rule of all. The greatest power was the one you never revealed. And deep inside, something ancient had started to awaken. Not through rage, through silence. He didn't ask for a master. He was assigned one. Lord Zorid, a low-ranking overseer known more for cruelty than skill. The kind of Sith who advanced not through strength, but by surviving the deaths of those above him. His reputation was built on breaking apprentices, not training them. When the boy was delivered to him, he said only one thing. "If you fail me, I'll peel the flesh from your bones." The boy said nothing. Zorid mistook this for fear. So did the others. He didn't correct them. Training became worse, harsher. Every lesson was a trap. Every praise followed by punishment. Zorid demanded strength but feared independence. He taught nothing of the Force, only how to kneel without hesitation, how to strike without remorse. The boy learned anyway. He listened in silence, studied every gesture, every hesitation. He watched how Zorid lied to his rivals, how he shifted blame when missions failed, how he hoarded stolen artifacts and twisted rituals for power he didn't understand. He began to see it clearly. Zorid wasn't strong, he was afraid. and fear was louder than any scream. One night, after a failed operation on Drummond Cars, Zorid flew into a rage. He blamed the boy, beat him, threw him across the chamber. His bones cracked, blood filled his mouth. Still, he didn't cry out. When it was done, Zorid turned his back and left. But something had shifted. The pain didn't matter anymore. What mattered was the silence that followed. The stillness in the air, the way the dark side moved through his shattered ribs and lit something inside him, not fury, not hatred. Precision. Clarity. The Force didn't scream. It whispered. And for the first time, he whispered back. He began to train alone, in the hours Zorid slept. Quiet rituals, breathing exercises, forgotten saber forms, reconstructed from fragments in old datapads. His wounds healed slower now, but they healed cleaner, stronger. And his vision deepened. He started sensing things before they happened. Not just attacks but intentions, thoughts, weakness. He could feel Zorid's fear before the man even entered the room. Could sense the insecurities the Lord buried under violence and ceremony. He knew then, Zorid would try to kill him, sooner or later. That was the nature of the Sith. But he wasn't afraid. Because now, he was ready. One afternoon, Zorid led a training exercise into the ruins of Tulak Horde's tomb. An ambush had been arranged, Republic agents hidden in the lower chambers. The assignment was a trap, a test. Someone wasn't meant to survive. But it wasn't the boy who failed. It was Zorid. The Republic soldiers were real, but they were poorly armed, ill-prepared. Zorid had expected them to kill the boy, but they didn't. Because when the first bolt was fired, the boy was already moving. He killed 5 men in 10 seconds. His blade moved like memory, no excess, no hesitation. The Force guided each strike, not with fury, but with eerie stillness. When the dust cleared, the tomb was silent again. Zorid tried to laugh it off, pretend it had all been a lesson. But the boy said nothing, only watched him. And Zorid knew, in that moment, that he had lost control. That night, the boy returned to the barracks covered in dirt and blood. Not a scratch on him. Whispers followed, not of glory, not of rebellion, but of inevitability. Something inside him had changed. Not from rage, not from defiance, from recognition. He knew now that power didn't come from fear. It came from understanding it. And someday, the masters would understand what they had created in silence. But by then, it would be far too late. They didn't choose him because he was gifted. They chose him because he survived. When the academy finally pulled him from the lower cells, the instructors expected another fragile child, another acolyte to break, to discard, to forget. But the moment he stepped into the training halls, they sensed it. Not strength, not talent. An absence. He felt no fear. While others trembled beneath the statues of ancient Sith Lords, he simply stared up at them as if looking at stone, not history. It confused the overseers. Children taken from the pits were supposed to panic. They were supposed to struggle to breathe. Many collapsed before training even began. But he didn't. He walked through the halls as if he had always belonged there, silent, steady, emotionless. He wasn't arrogant, he wasn't confident. He was simply untouched. Like someone who had been emptied long before the academy ever found him. The instructors whispered about it in private. Another broken one. He won't last a week. No sense of fear. Not natural. But fear wasn't something he lacked. Fear was something he had learned to bury. The first trial came at dawn, a group sparring session designed to thin the herd. 20 acolytes entered the ring. Only 10 were expected to walk out. The instructors didn't hide their intentions. They wanted desperation. They wanted violence. He gave them neither. When the whistle blew, the others charged, some with anger, some with panic, some with the sharp, wild hope of impressing a Sith Lord. He did not move at first. He watched, studied their footwork, their balance, their breathing. He waited for someone to attack him. It didn't take long. A larger boy lunged, swinging with enough force to break ribs. The strike should have landed. But the boy from the pit stepped aside in a single calm motion, as if he had known exactly when and where the blow would fall. He didn't look surprised. He didn't even blink. He countered with one hit. The larger boy landed on the ground, unable to stand. The instructors stopped whispering. Another acolyte came at him, then another, and another. They attacked from different angles, trying to overwhelm him with numbers, but they were loud, predictable, driven by emotion. He was not. He moved like someone walking through a memory, his blocks precise, his strikes minimal, his steps efficient. He didn't waste breath on grunts or shouts. He didn't celebrate when an opponent fell. He simply continued. Calm, cold, controlled. By the end of the trial, 12 acolytes lay on the floor, some unconscious, some bruised, all defeated. He remained standing, barely marked at all. But he did not feel pride. He did not feel victory. He felt the same emptiness he had always known. And that was what frightened the instructors most. Power they understood, anger they encouraged, ambition they nurtured. But emptiness, that was something rarer, something they could not shape, something that resisted control. Some believed he hid his emotions. Some believed he had none left. Both were true. In the days that followed, he was tested again and again. Labyrinth trials, endurance trials, fear chambers, simulated executions. He passed each one with the same unchanging expression. When shown illusions meant to break the mind, he simply stared. When forced to confront terrors from the subconscious, he remained still. Others screamed, others begged, others collapsed. He did not. He walked through nightmares the same way he walked through hallways with quiet steps and dead eyes. It wasn't talent that elevated him in the eyes of the academy. It wasn't skill or training or lineage. It was refusal. He refused to lose. He refused to break. He refused to feel what they wanted him to feel. And the Sith noticed. Not because he was stronger than the others, but because he was becoming something else entirely. Something the academy had not prepared for. Something born from silence. Something shaped by survival. Something waiting. It wasn't long before the others began to fear him. Not because he was violent, but because he wasn't. Acolytes rose through the Sith Academy with rage. They screamed in duels, clawed for recognition, burned with the need to be seen. Every glance from a Sith Lord was a prize. Every lesson was a performance. But he never performed. He stood at the edge of every room, arms behind his back, eyes fixed, silent. And somehow, he was always watching. He memorized each rival's habits, how they walked, how they hesitated, how they lied. He saw through the masks they wore, the ones that said, "I am strong," even while their hands shook at night. He did not mock them. He did not confront them. He simply remembered. And the Force remembered with him. They called him the Hollow One behind his back. Said he had no spirit, no soul. Some whispered that he'd died in the pit and that whatever came out wasn't human anymore. They weren't wrong. He didn't need anger to win. He didn't need fear to run. He didn't need hate to strike. All the emotions the instructors told them to feed, he ignored. And still, he surpassed them. He could sense intentions in the air, hear lies beneath a breath, read movements before they began. The instructors noticed. One summoned him late one evening, curious to see how far the boy's instincts went. He placed him in a chamber with 2 other acolytes, no weapons, no warning, only a voice from above. Only one of you leaves. The door sealed shut. The others looked at him, nervous, uncertain. He didn't wait. He struck first. Not with rage, but with precision. A knee to the ribs, a twist of the wrist, a brutal elbow that cracked bone. One collapsed immediately. The other tried to fight back, flailing wild. He stepped inside the arc of a punch and snapped the boy's leg at the knee. It was over in less than a minute. He stood in the silence, blood on his face, breathing slow. The voice above said nothing for a while. Then the door opened. He didn't look back at the ones on the floor. He didn't need to. They wouldn't rise again. It was that moment more than any trial that the instructors understood what he was becoming. He was not fearless because he had conquered fear. He was fearless because he had nothing left to lose. And that made him dangerous. One of the lords took an interest. Darth Nox, a cold tactician known for collecting broken weapons and sharpening them into tools. He summoned the boy to observe a live interrogation. A captured Jedi Knight, bloodied, bound, barely conscious. "You were once a slave," Skavek said, watching the boy closely. "Do you feel pity for him?" The boy looked at the prisoner, looked at the eyes that begged for mercy, and then back to the Sith Lord. "No," he said. Skavak smiled, "Then break him." He obeyed. Not because he wanted to, but because he knew the game. And he played it perfectly. He didn't scream at the Jedi, didn't strike him at random. He asked questions, spoke slowly, watched reactions. When the Jedi stayed silent, he cut not deep, just enough to teach. And over hours, he learned how pain shaped people, where the line was, how long it took for someone to stop pretending they were strong. By the end, the Jedi was weeping, and the boy still hadn't raised his voice. Skavak never spoke to him again. But the guards began keeping their distance. The other acolytes stopped meeting his eyes. Not because he had risen too far, but because he had stopped needing to rise at all. The Sith Academy did not fear the broken. It feared the proud. Because the proud believed they were owed power. They saw victory as birthright, bloodline as proof, legacy as armor. They arrived dressed in name and title, walking as if the halls of Korriban had been built for them. And one by one, he watched them fall. They didn't see him as a threat. At first, he didn't speak during lectures, didn't posture during combat. He never reminded others of his rank or his record. That was how the proud announced themselves loudly, endlessly. But he had no name to defend. And that made him invisible. Until the moment they faced him. Some tried to humiliate him, challenged him in front of the instructors, laughed at his silence, called him filth, pit-born, lesser. One even tried to knock him unconscious in the mess hall with a tray. It didn't work. He shattered the boy's arm in 3 places before the tray hit the floor. The room went silent. And from that day on, the proud spoke more quietly around him. The instructors did not intervene. They encouraged rivalries, wanted blood to teach lessons. And they watched him closely now, not to see if he would win, but to see how. Because he never struck first unless required, never lingered in cruelty, never gloated. His victories were clean, swift, surgical. The proud didn't understand that. They mistook his silence for weakness, and their final lesson always came the same way. Not with fury, but with collapse. One by one, they tried to outmaneuver him, isolate him, provoke him into mistakes, and each time, he responded like a mirror, reflecting what they brought until it broke them. A daughter of a Sith Lord challenged him during a public exhibition. She spoke of bloodlines, of strength, of the meaning of true power. She told him to kneel. He didn't answer. When the fight began, she lunged with speed, precision. She was well trained, her strikes were exact, her control refined. But he didn't fight her technique. He fought her rhythm. He let her lead the pace, let her think she was in control. And then, when she overextended, he ended it. 2 moves, 1 strike, a fracture across her jaw that echoed through the chamber. She collapsed. And when she did, no one moved to help her. The instructors didn't even mark the score. Because the point had been made. He was no longer rising through the ranks. He was separating from them entirely. A new kind of threat, a shape they hadn't yet named. Something that couldn't be measured by blood or lineage. He didn't care about titles, or approval, or reputation. He cared only about the outcome. And deep down, that terrified even the lords who once ignored him. Because there was nothing to manipulate, nothing to seduce, only control. And when someone doesn't fight for favor, they become impossible to control. In time, the proud stopped testing him, stopped speaking his name. When he entered a room, conversations fell quiet. When he walked into the training yard, others stepped back. Not out of respect, not yet. Out of fear. Because by then, everyone understood. He wasn't climbing the ranks. He wasn't chasing a master's favor. He was waiting. And every lesson they threw at him, every rival, every trial, every trap only sharpened the edge they couldn't see. The blade that hadn't been drawn yet, but would be. Soon. They called it the final gauntlet. A last rite before Ascension. A test of will, endurance, and cruelty. For most acolytes, it was a week of suffering that broke the mind before it broke the body. The few who survived emerged changed. Not stronger, just colder. He was chosen without ceremony. No speech, no warning. Just a datapad with coordinates. And silence. The gauntlet was held in a valley scarred by ancient Sith battles, a place where the sand still smelled like death, where weapons from wars thousands of years past still littered the rock. He arrived alone, and the first thing he saw was the body of an acolyte who had come before him, already broken, already discarded. He didn't look away. He kept walking. The trials began without structure. He was hunted, starved, forced through environmental torments designed to cripple. Hallucinations laced the food. Poisoned vapor filled the air. Sith specters called to him from the ruins. But he never stopped moving. Because the only rule was survival. And he had mastered that long before the gauntlet began. On the 3rd day, a rival acolyte found him. one who had spoken boldly back in the academy, a pure-blood Sith with the favor of a counselor. He demanded a duel. The boy didn't answer. The Sith struck first, screaming his bloodline, his right to rule, his destiny. The boy dodged once, then again, then struck. Just once. The pure blood fell. No final blow, no taunt, no fury. Just a broken leg, a shattered pride, and silence. He left him alive. Not out of mercy, because mercy implied feeling. And he had stopped feeling anything. The final trial came in the tomb of Naga Sadow, a collapsed ruin filled with collapsing stone and poisoned air. Acolytes had died there before. Even lords refused to enter without protection. But he went in without hesitation. He didn't speak to the shadows that moved along the walls, didn't answer the voices that mimicked the dead. He descended until the air felt thick with memory. And there, in the silence, he felt something else. Not a ghost, not an illusion. An invitation. It wasn't in words. It was in the way the Force bent around him. As if the darkness had recognized him. Not as a master, not as an intruder, as one of its own. When he emerged, his body was cracked and bleeding, his lungs burned, his eyes stung. But he was standing, and that was all that mattered. The instructors met him at the canyon's edge. No applause, no words, just a simple nod. He had passed. But they didn't understand what they'd created. They thought they had forged another blade for the Empire, another servant of the Code, another Sith to feed into the endless wars. They didn't see the truth. He hadn't survived the gauntlet. He had consumed it. The pain, the silence, the betrayal, the dead. They were part of him now. Not scars, not memories. Blueprints of what he was becoming. He returned to the academy not as an acolyte, not as a student, but as a name whispered behind closed doors. A warning passed between lords. A question no one wanted to answer. What happens when the one you cannot break stops following your rules? The answer was simple. He rises. Not with pride, not with celebration, but with quiet certainty. Because victory wasn't a destination. It was the natural result of becoming everything the galaxy tried to erase. And from this moment on, he would not be erased again. The Academy said it was an honor. Only the most promising acolytes were sent into the deep tombs. A trial of trust. A glimpse into the legacy they were meant to inherit. But everyone knew the truth. It was a test of survival. A culling in disguise. The tombs beneath Korriban were not empty. They were not ruins. They were memories buried in stone. And the dead did not sleep quietly. He was sent alone. No supplies, no escort. Just a single command. Retrieve a relic from the lower chambers of the tomb of Ajunta Pol, first of the Dark Lords. The one who led the ancient exiles into darkness. Others had gone before. Most had never come back. Those who did returned wrong. Twitching, whispers in their ears, half mad with fear. They spoke of shadows in the stone, of voices that knew their names, of things older than the Sith themselves. He said nothing when they gave the order, didn't flinch, didn't hesitate. He simply went. The entrance yawned open, like a wound in the desert rock. The sun stopped at the threshold. Beyond it, only cold. He stepped into the dark. No torches, no glow rods. Just the faint hum of the Force vibrating through old dust and sealed air. Each step echoed. Not outward, but inward, Like the tomb wasn't just remembering him. It was watching him. The walls were carved with history, figures frozen in agony, Sith Lords with names long forgotten, locked in poses of triumph and pain. Holocrons shattered, bones untouched, bloodstains that never dried. He didn't look away. He didn't speak. He walked for hours, maybe longer. Time lost meaning. His footsteps grew slower, not from fear but from weight. A pressure building in the air, as if something enormous was curled around the stone, breathing without breath. And then, it began. Not a sound, a feeling, something moving behind his thoughts. Not a presence, not yet. A recognition. The deeper he went, the stronger it became. Not fear but familiarity, as if he had been here before, as if the tombs remembered him not as an intruder, but as a reflection. In one chamber, he found the relic, a fragment of a sword buried in an altar, sealed in ancient runes. He reached for it, and the moment his skin touched the metal, the air vanished. Not literally, but from his chest, from his mind. Everything stopped, and then he heard it. A voice, not outside, inside, sharp, cold, ancient. Not strong, but empty. He didn't answer. Not blood, but hunger. He stood still. Around him, the walls began to breathe. Statues cracked, dust rose in spirals, and from the stone, shadows began to take form. Faces without features, eyes without light. They did not attack. They observed, not with curiosity, but with certainty, as if they had been waiting for him. Not for this moment, but for who he would become. They didn't see legacy in him. They didn't see destiny. They saw space, a vessel, something to be filled, something willing. He didn't resist the pressure, because it wasn't pain. It was recognition. The voices did not scream. They whispered. Names, places, memories that were not his. And in that silence, he accepted them. Not because he wanted power, but because he wanted to understand what he had always felt, that he was not alone, even in his own mind. When he left the tomb, the others watched him carefully. He said nothing. He carried the relic. But something behind his eyes had changed. He no longer looked forward. He looked inward, to the ghosts that had not left him, and never would. The relic was delivered. The instructors said nothing. He returned it without a word, and they didn't ask how he found it. They didn't ask what he saw. They only marked his name down, nodded once, and turned away. But they knew something had changed. He didn't sleep that night. Not because of fear, because of noise. The tomb hadn't stayed behind. It followed him. The voices didn't speak in language now. They spoke in weight, in silence that pressed against the skin, in flickers of thought that did not feel like his own. When he closed his eyes, he saw faces that had no bodies, felt memories he didn't live. And through it all, one feeling remained. Hunger. Not his. Not yet. But close. It sat in his chest like a second breath, deeper than instinct, quieter than thought. It wasn't desire, it wasn't ambition, it was emptiness shaped like purpose. And it began to move through him. When he trained, he moved differently, not faster, not stronger, but sharper. His blade cut at angles others didn't see. His footwork matched rhythms that hadn't been taught. He anticipated strikes not because he studied them, but because he had already watched them in his mind before they happened. The instructors thought he was advancing. They didn't understand. He wasn't improving. He was aligning with something that had no name. Other acolytes tried to mimic him, tried to spar with him, tried to challenge the silence he carried like a second shadow. They failed. One by one, they broke themselves against it. Because they were chasing power. He was becoming it. He began wandering the outer chambers at night alone, where no instructors watched. He returned to forgotten halls, meditated near sealed tombs, not to seek knowledge, but to listen. And the tombs listened back. One night, in the ruined antechamber of Marka Ragnos, he sat without speaking for hours. And something in the stone stirred. Not a ghost, not a spirit, but an echo. A fragment of presence, the afterimage of something that once ruled, that once bled and killed and commanded with silence. He reached out, not with his hand, with the hunger that lived behind his eyes. And the Force responded, not with light, not with darkness, with weight. The temperature dropped, his vision blurred, the world narrowed. He felt pain in his chest that didn't belong to him, a death that was not his, a scream that had never left his throat. And then it was gone. But the hunger remained. It fed on the silence, it grew in the quiet between thoughts, it learned him. And he let it. He didn't ask what it was. Because some truths only reveal themselves to those who already understand. He began to feel it in others now, their fears, their flaws, their doubt. He could taste them in the Force like rot in water. And it made him calm. Because he knew they were weaker. Not because of their pain, but because they refused to live inside it. He didn't want their fear, didn't crave their respect. He only wanted to know why the hunger chose him, why it moved through him, why it waited, because he could feel it, waiting. For something, for someone, for the right moment to take form. And he knew when that moment came he would not resist. Because it wasn't possession. It was purpose. The ghosts beneath Korriban didn't need another Sith. They needed a vessel. And they had found one. The tombs did not whisper to everyone. Some acolytes heard only the wind. Others claimed the silence was maddening. But for him, the silence wasn't empty. It was alive. Not with sound, but with memory. Old breath, old hate, old sorrow. And the deeper he went, the more the dust began to speak. He returned to the catacombs beneath Nagasado's shrine. The overseers said nothing. Technically, he wasn't forbidden. But none of them expected him to come back. No one wanted to. The Force was too loud there. The air too heavy. Time slowed between the walls. Thought became unstable. But that was where he felt clearest. Where the voices became words. They didn't speak as one. They arrived in pieces. Wounds that had forgotten they were bleeding. Shapes of language worn down by centuries. Some muttered names. Others screamed questions. None of them asked to be saved. He sat in the center of the chamber and listened. No lights, no guards, just the pressure of stone and the dark energy of ancient lives unfinished. He didn't flinch, because he was beginning to understand something no instructor ever taught. The Sith were not defined by victory. They were defined by memory. Failure carved deeper than conquest. Pain echoed longer than glory. Every lord buried here had left something behind, not just relics, but grief, regret, rage, and beneath that, loneliness. Not all of them had fallen in battle. Some had been betrayed, some consumed by apprentices, some simply forgotten. And in the Force, that forgetting hurt more than death. He felt that pain now, carried it like a weight around his spine, not his, but not foreign either. It moved through him, and he didn't resist. Because he recognized it. He had been forgotten once, too. And now, the tombs remembered him. One spirit reached out clearer than the others, an echo of Ludo Kresh, rival of Naga Sado. Once called the cautious, the protector of the old ways. His voice was fractured, buried beneath centuries of hate. But the message was clear. All of us died for nothing. The boy didn't answer aloud. He only breathed slower, let the Force settle around him. Kresh spoke of betrayal, of visions denied, of temples lost not to war but to ego. And the boy understood. Because in the academy, he saw it, too. The lords who postured for influence, the masters who feared their own apprentices, the rituals repeated without understanding, power without purpose, rule without legacy. The boy did not judge them. He simply knew he would not become them. And the spirits knew it, too. Because he listened. Not with reverence, not with submission, with attention. That was what the dead wanted most. To be heard, to be known, to not be forgotten again. So he stayed longer than allowed, slept near the crypts, ate in silence among bones, traced carvings older than the Republic with his bare fingers. And the dust whispered more. It told him where the false artifacts were hidden, which relics still contained fragments of consciousness, which instructors had stolen secrets from holocrons they couldn't open. He didn't speak of these things, not to the others, not even to himself. He simply carried them. The whispers became part of his breath, and the Force around him began to change. The instructors noticed it, a chill in the air when he entered. Holocrons refusing to open for others but unlocking in his hands. A growing stillness that made even the lords hesitate. They thought he was cursed. But it wasn't a curse. It was acknowledgement. The tombs beneath Korriban had chosen him. Not as a master, but as a memory that would not die. Something had changed in him. The instructors didn't know what. The acolytes didn't ask. But all of them could feel it, a weight that followed him, silent but suffocating. It wasn't his presence. It was his stillness. He moved like someone who was already watching from somewhere else. He no longer reacted to pain, no longer winced at anger. When someone shouted in his face, he blinked once slowly, like the moment didn't deserve urgency. They called it arrogance, but it wasn't. It was distance. Because his mind was no longer tethered to the present. Part of him was always listening. Even when he stood alone, hands clasped behind his back, eyes calm, he was hearing voices no one else could hear, remembering things that had not yet happened. Seeing patterns in the Force that bent around others unnoticed. In sparring drills, he no longer fought to win. He simply endured, letting the opponent waste their strength, letting their emotions burn themselves out. And when they tired, when their form broke, he struck. Not to punish, to end it, and they never challenged him twice. Even the instructors began to shift their approach. Some avoided his name during lessons. Others watched him with narrowed eyes, as if unsure what they were witnessing. Acolytes were supposed to rise through power, fury, hunger, but he didn't climb. He settled, like something that had already arrived. One instructor reported him to a Sith Lord, claimed he was harboring forbidden knowledge, accessing tombs he hadn't been cleared for. The Lord summoned him, asked if the accusation was true. He didn't deny it. He simply stared. And the Lord, a woman known for cruelty, leaned forward and studied him for a long time. Then she said, "I don't know what you are, but I see no fear in you, only waiting." She let him go, not because she believed he was innocent, because she sensed the same thing the tombs had whispered long ago. He was not becoming a Sith. He was becoming something Sith once were. Before the code, before the hierarchy, before the Empire, he no longer reached for power the way others did. He didn't crave it, didn't dream of titles or thrones, because power wasn't something he needed to take. It came to him. One evening, during a ritual in the outer canyon, a fellow acolyte lost control of the Force. The blast sent stone and fire in every direction. Students screamed. One was crushed. 2 more burned. He didn't move. He stood perfectly still as the wave passed. When the smoke cleared, he hadn't taken a single step, and the others watched in silence as he looked through the flames with those same unblinking eyes. Not cruel, not angry, just calm, as if the death around him was not unexpected, as if it had already happened long before this moment. That night, the survivors whispered about him in private. They didn't speak his name. Most didn't know it. But they spoke of his stare. How it didn't judge. How it didn't forgive. How it felt like being measured and found temporary. Some began to wonder if he was even alive, not in body, but in soul, because whatever he had once been was now gone, replaced by something older, something quieter, something no longer surprised by pain or power or prophecy. A boy who once lived in silence now carried the weight of ghosts, and he saw more than anyone should. Not just through the Force, through memory, through ruin, through what was buried and what refused to die. He didn't blink, because there was nothing left to miss. Lord Zash chose her apprentices carefully. She didn't want warriors. She didn't want leaders. She wanted pieces, quiet tools, people she could shape, discard, replace. Her power came not from open strength, but from subtlety. Smiles, secrets, and shadows. She found him in the archives, sitting alone with a half-shattered holocron from the Naga Sado era. Others passed by without looking. Zash didn't. She watched him as he turned the broken crystal in his palm, reading it with no teacher, no help. Just silence. She saw what others missed. Not ambition, not arrogance. Stillness. The kind that made people easy to use. She approached him with laughter in her voice, like they were old friends. She asked no questions, offered no flattery. She simply placed a hand on his shoulder and said, "I've been looking for someone like you." He didn't answer. He didn't need to. Because the Force around her felt wrong, clean on the surface, but oily beneath. Her smile was wide, but her eyes never stopped calculating. She didn't want an apprentice. She wanted a body. She brought him into her chambers that same night, introduced him to Sith rituals others hadn't seen. Let him read texts most acolytes weren't trusted with. Whispered to him of her place on the Dark Council, of her political enemies, of secrets hidden in the tombs of Korriban and Drummond Kaas. And all the while, she smiled. He listened. Never questioned, never resisted. because he already understood who she was. He had seen this shape before in other acolytes, in failed masters, in the tombs. A predator pretending to nurture. Zash taught with flattery. She praised him for silence, for control. She said he was different from the others, smarter, more focused, less ruled by emotion. And for the first time in years, he let someone believe they understood him. He even nodded when she spoke, smiled, sometimes, not because he believed her, but because he needed her to believe him. Because he knew the game now. It wasn't about rage. It wasn't about survival. It was about patience. Zash paraded him before other lords, called him her prize, let him duel rivals and retrieve relics. She sent him into the ruins of Tulak Horde's deepest sanctums. Had him gather artifacts tied to essence transfer, spirit anchoring, and Sith alchemy, all while claiming it was research. He never asked what the research was for. He didn't have to. He knew she was preparing a ritual, knew she was nearing the end of her current body's use. The wrinkles around her eyes were growing deeper. Her voice had started to crack between syllables. She praised him more often now, touched his shoulder longer, told him how rare it was for an apprentice to rise so quickly. And still, he said nothing. Because Zash had already made her mistake. She believed he had no ambition of his own, that his quiet obedience meant loyalty. But it wasn't loyalty. It was positioning. The way a blade rests before it's drawn. One evening, she brought him into her inner sanctum. Lit by red crystal lamps, the room pulsed with old energy. Ritual lines carved into the stone, symbols glowing faintly underfoot. She smiled wider than ever before. "You've been so faithful," she said. "And now I'll give you everything." He bowed, said nothing, and let her begin. Because the truth was simple. She didn't choose him. She summoned him. And what she had summoned could not be dismissed. Lord Zash did not teach the way other Sith Lords did. She did not shout. She did not strike. She did not force her apprentices to kneel beneath fear. Instead, she taught with warmth, with softness, with a smile that felt safe, until you realized it was sharp enough to cut through bone. She praised him more than anyone ever had, told him he was gifted, told him his silence meant discipline, not emptiness. Whenever he entered a room, she lit up with delight, as if she had discovered a rare treasure buried in the sands. And he let her believe she had. Because Zash's kindness was not real. It was a mask she wore to hide her hunger. A hunger deeper than ambition. A hunger aimed directly at him. She gave him knowledge others were never trusted with. Forbidden rituals, abandoned holocrons, half-broken scrolls from the great hyperspace war. She spoke of spirit binding, of the earliest alchemists, of techniques that could make a body strong or claim another's entirely. He studied everything she offered, but not for the reasons she hoped. During lessons, he watched her closely. He noticed how she trembled after using the Force too long, how she hid the cracks in her voice, how the glow in her eyes dimmed a little more each day. Zash's smile was bright, but her body was dying, burned out by rituals she never should have attempted, damaged by a hunger that was slowly consuming her own flesh. She needed a new vessel, and she believed she had found it. She rewarded him constantly now. Small relics, amulets of protection, notes scribbled with ancient runes. She told him they were gifts for his progress, but he knew better. These were not rewards. These were preparations. Zash wanted him strong enough to endure the ritual, to hold her essence, to carry her forward. He let her continue. At night, he meditated alone. The spirits from the tombs whispered to him through the dark. They warned him of her plan, showed flashes of betrayal, a ritual chamber glowing red, a body falling to the floor, her voice dripping into his mind. But he did not act. Patience had become his greatest weapon. He wanted to understand her fully, to know her methods, to watch how she rehearsed each lie, because Zash believed she was grooming a perfect apprentice, one who trusted her completely. She did not see the truth. He trusted nothing. One evening, she tested him. A prisoner had been brought in, a spy, half broken, tied to a chair. Zash asked him to torture the man, not for information, but to generate fear. Raw, sharp, desperate fear. She wanted to measure how well his body absorbed dark energy, how it would feel when she finally slipped inside. The prisoner screamed, begged, cursed. He didn't. He did what she asked. Not out of cruelty, out of knowledge. Each act brought them closer to the moment she believed she would win, and the moment he knew she wouldn't. After the prisoner fell silent, Zash approached him with soft steps. She rested a hand on his cheek, smiled like a mother comforting a child. "You're perfect," she whispered. He stared back without blinking. Not grateful, not obedient, just waiting. Zash left the room humming, pleased with herself. She believed every lie she had planted. She believed his silence meant submission. She believed she had crafted the perfect body to replace her own failing shell. She believed all of it. And he let her. Because her greatest mistake wasn't choosing him. It was believing she controlled him. Their lessons were nearly done, and she had no idea how close she stood to becoming the final one. It began in silence. Not fear, not urgency, not even ceremony. Just Zash, waiting in her sanctum, surrounded by crimson lamps and carved runes that pulsed like veins beneath the floor. Her voice was calm, her breath steady, her body frail but smiling. She welcomed him in like a mother greeting a son. Told him this was the moment he had earned. That his training was complete. That she was proud of him. She gestured to the center of the chamber, where a raised stone platform glowed faintly. Etched into it were ancient Sith sigils. Symbols of binding, of essence transfer, of dominance through displacement. He recognized them all. Because she had taught them to him. He stepped forward. No resistance, no questions. He lay down on the stone and closed his eyes. Zash began to chant. The air thickened, not like mist, like something older. Something inside the Force folding in on itself. The light from the runes pulsed faster. The shadows along the walls began to shift. And then he felt it. Her presence. Leaving her body. Dripping through the air like smoke without a source. Crawling toward him. Slipping beneath his skin. Wrapping around his mind. She whispered to him as she moved. "Don't be afraid. Let go." But he wasn't afraid. He had never been afraid. And he didn't let go. He opened his mind just enough to let her in, and then closed the door behind her. She entered his thoughts like a conqueror, reached for control, reached for dominance, and found only silence. Not emptiness. A trap. Her voice trembled now. It cracked mid-sentence. She tried to speak again to command, but there was no room left to take. Because he wasn't just prepared. He was waiting. He had memorized her process, had felt the ritual from both sides before she ever stepped into it. She had taught him how to hold her, and he had learned how to keep her out. Zash tried to pull back, tried to retreat to her body, but it was already gone. He opened his eyes. She didn't. Her frame stood limp beside the altar, her face still smiling, frozen in satisfaction that no longer belonged to her. He sat up, breathed once, and let the silence settle. The Force was calm now. No resistance, no noise, only stillness. He rose to his feet and walked over to her corpse, studied the way her skin had cracked, how her hands had curled inwards as the last moment slipped away. There was no ceremony, no explosion, no scream. Only the quiet death of a master who thought she understood control, and never did. He didn't speak. There was no one left to hear it. Zash's body would be disposed of in silence. Official records would say she fell to illness, a complication from long exposure to dark energy. No one would ask questions. The Dark Council wouldn't care. Because power had shifted without a single sound. He left the chamber alone. The others noticed immediately. Something in the way he walked, the absence of Zash's voice, the calm in his gaze. Rumors spread quickly. Some said she had passed her legacy on, others that she had vanished into ritual failure. But no one challenged him. Because the darkness around him had changed. It no longer watched. It listened. And in that quiet, they all understood. Zash had not been defeated. She had been consumed. Not by rage, not by rebellion, by something she never anticipated. A student who needed no instruction. Only a moment, and a reason. Zash was gone, but her body remained. Not as a relic, not as a memory, as proof. That death in the Sith Order didn't always look like a body on the floor. Sometimes it looked like absence, a voice missing from meetings, a name left unspoken, a chamber sealed and never reopened. The academy moved on quickly. It always did. There were no questions, no accusations, no trials. Zash's death was treated as a quiet transition, the natural end of a scholar who had flown too close to power. Her rituals were blamed, her body quietly removed, her research vault locked. But her apprentice remained. And he didn't explain anything. He didn't take her seat. He didn't demand her title. He simply kept doing what she taught him or what she thought she had taught him. Except now, no one told him where to go. No one called him by name. No one summoned him with authority. Because they didn't know what to call him anymore. Not apprentice. Not student. Something had changed. He no longer walked with the others. He walked alone. Into vaults that once denied him. Into temples that once required permission. Into secrets even Zash had only whispered about. And the Force bent around him differently now. Like it recognized what had happened. Like it saw not the death of a master, but the awakening of something that could not be mastered. He returned to her old sanctum weeks later. The runes still glowed, the altar still hummed with power, but the air was no longer hers. It was his. He placed his hand on the stone where he had once lain, closed his eyes, and listened. No voices answered, because there was no one left to teach him. Only echoes of what he had already become. Others watched him more closely now. Some feared him, others envied him. A few whispered theories. They said Zash lived on in him, that she had succeeded in her ritual, and that he was merely a puppet wearing her face. They were wrong. She had not survived, but something of her had remained. Not her thoughts, not her will, her hunger. And now, it was his. Not for her reasons, not for immortality, for something deeper, something older than conquest. The hunger to know, to understand what even the ancient lords had failed to grasp, how the Force moved through death, how the soul could fracture, how the self could survive without form. Zash had chased it to preserve herself. He chased it to become something no one had ever been. He kept her name on the records, left it untouched, said nothing of her fate, because she was no longer his enemy. She was part of the foundation beneath him. A mistake, a stepping stone, a voice he would never hear again. And in the quiet that followed, he began to feel the next call. It didn't come from the academy. It came from the deeper tombs, where ghosts didn't whisper. They waited. Because what walked the halls now was no longer a student, no longer someone to be guided, tested, or broken. He had entered the ritual as a tool, and walked out as something undefined. No scars, no questions, no need to explain, because the body had not died. Only the illusion that it had ever belonged to someone else. Power did not announce him. It didn't need to. He emerged from Zash's chambers with no title, no ceremony, no blood on his hands. But something had shifted. Those who saw him that day remembered one thing above all else. No one looked him in the eyes. They couldn't. Not because they feared punishment, not because they knew what he had done, but because whatever stood in Zash's place now was something else entirely. The Sith Academy on Dromund Kaas responded the way it always did, with silence. Lords whispered. Acolytes kept their distance. Council members acknowledged the change but made no move to stop it. Because what mattered most to the Empire was result. And he produced results. He took over Zash's network quietly, absorbed her agents, restructured her alliances, cleansed her legacy of failure, not by burning it down, but by turning it into something useful. No speeches, no promises, just presence. He made no move to claim a seat on the Dark Council. Not yet. He had no interest in being watched, no desire to posture. He let the others fight over politics while he turned inward. To power. The real kind. It began with artifacts, fragments pulled from the deep vaults beneath Kaas City, holocrons left untouched by their creators, Sith blades still humming with echoes of forgotten owners. He didn't study them. He fed from them. Every item became a tether, a link to something old, something unfinished. The Force in him didn't just resonate, it pulled. It absorbed. And slowly, the spirits trapped in the ancient metal began to awaken. And he listened. Not to beg for guidance, to measure what they had left behind. He didn't seek their wisdom. He sought their weakness. Because even the greatest Sith had died for a reason. And if he was to rise further, he needed to know what mistakes they had buried in their tombs. The Academy noticed his growing strength, not in his saber, but in his silence. When he entered a room, the Force bent unnaturally. When he spoke, the air changed. The shadows stretched. He did not raise his voice. He didn't need to. Because his words no longer came from one mind. Something else had begun speaking through him. Not possession. Integration. The ghosts of the past did not pass through him. They stayed, bound by will, caged by hunger. And with each one, his voice became a little colder. his gaze a little heavier. He was invited to Nar Shaddaa next, not for politics, but to resolve a dispute between Sith Lords over control of a powerful relic smuggled off Ziost. It should have been a bloodbath. It wasn't. He arrived alone, spoke only once, and left with the relic. No one challenged him, because those who did weren't seen again. And those who watched swore the shadows behind him moved before he did. His rise wasn't meteoric. It was methodical. He didn't conquer with charisma. He didn't build alliances. He accumulated gravity. Wherever he walked, the Force felt heavier, as if time slowed around him, as if the galaxy itself hesitated. Not out of respect, out of uncertainty, because by now, no one could say for sure where the man ended and the dead began. He didn't believe the Force was something to serve. To him it was a current, a river that moved through pain, through power, through memory. The Jedi worshipped it, the Sith bent it to their will. But he did something older, something simpler. He listened, and it answered, not with visions, not with commands, with voices, fragments of Sith Lords who had died without purpose, ghosts carved from rage, shadows caught in ritual. They had once been masters, tyrants, prophets. Now they were sound, and they followed him, not out of loyalty, out of gravity, because he could hold them. On Dromund Kaas, he returned to Zash's archives not to honor her, but to dismantle her. Her scrolls were incomplete, her translations flawed. She had seen the edge of something ancient, and looked away. He stepped through it. He rebuilt forgotten matrices of Sith alchemy, aligned Zash's spirit-binding theories with echoes drawn from the Treyas Academy's final cycle. He cross-referenced rituals lost since the fall of Ragnos with the hunger doctrine of Darth Nihilus. The shape of the truth emerged. It was not about summoning spirits. It was about housing them. He began with one, a nameless sorcerer caught for centuries inside a fractured kyber shard. The process was difficult but clean. The soul whispered, it fought, and then it submitted. The second came from a relic uncovered on Malachor. Stronger, a will that resisted until his own surged through it like ice. Each time he changed. A memory lost, a word he no longer remembered how to pronounce. One night, he stood in front of a mirror and didn't recognize the face staring back. But he didn't stop, because with every voice he claimed, he gained something more. Reflexes he hadn't trained, languages he hadn't studied, movements from dueling styles no longer taught. He began to fight like someone else, speak like someone else. He didn't reject it. He welcomed it, and the spirits did not scream. They whispered. He traveled to forgotten temples, Ashes Re, Dathomir, Kar Delba, places the modern Sith feared or ignored. He entered them alone, left with pieces no one else could carry. He didn't bring back artifacts. He brought back souls. One laughed as it died, telling him, "You will never sleep in silence again." Another wept, not for itself, but for him. He said nothing, because it was already too late. By the time he returned to Dromund Kaas, something inside him had changed. He no longer walked like a man. He moved like a storm sealed in flesh. Others noticed. Acolytes fell silent in his presence. Lords avoided speaking his name. There was no title, no declaration. But the weight of him filled every space. He didn't have to speak to be heard. Because when he entered a room, the Force didn't respond to one voice. It responded to many. He wasn't haunted. He wasn't possessed. He was full. Conversations with him felt strange, like speaking to someone remembering 10 things at once. Sometimes, his accent shifted mid-sentence. Sometimes, he answered questions no one had asked yet. And still, there was no madness. Only clarity. Because he never tried to control the ghosts. He had made room for them. And they had made room for him. He wasn't a Sith Lord chasing power. He was power rebuilt from pieces of the dead. And when he reached into the Force now, it whispered one truth. He was not the end of a line. He was the beginning of something no one had prepared for. He didn't challenge the Sith Lords directly. He didn't have to. By now, his influence moved without instruction. Former allies of Zash aligned with him out of fear or instinct. Acolytes pledged loyalty in whispers. Overseers stopped questioning his presence. His name was rarely spoken, but always understood. Because his rise was not loud. It was structural. He entered political games not with ambition but with inevitability. While others plotted, he moved. While others spoke, he listened. And when someone vanished, no one asked where they had gone. Because they knew. And they were glad it wasn't them. His power didn't come from titles. It came from presence. From the way Sith Lords with decades of influence paused before speaking in his presence. From how the Dark Council no longer spoke of him as Zash's successor but as a force of his own. And still, he said almost nothing. He didn't need to convince. He only needed to remain. The most dangerous Sith had always been the ones who didn't crave attention. The ones who didn't need crowds or applause. Because the galaxy remembered not the loudest voices. It remembered the ones who never had to speak. Whispers began to spread. That he no longer slept. That he didn't eat. That his eyes had changed color slightly. And sometimes, when he blinked, it looked like he wasn't alone behind them. No one had proof. But proof wasn't necessary. Not anymore. Because when he looked at someone too long, they felt it, a tightening in the chest, a weight behind the eyes, like they were being watched by more than one presence. Some fainted under it. Some wept. A few never recovered. The council tested him. They sent assassins, quiet ones, lords who had once led wars, shadows with names no longer spoken. They moved like death until they reached him. None returned. He never reported their deaths. But their silence echoed across Kars City. And in time, no more was sent. The Sith Order began to shift around him. Not violently, not in revolt, but like stone bending to pressure over time. He made no demands, issued no ultimatums, but when he entered a room, arguments ended. Because power, once fully realized, needs no introduction. He began visiting tombs others avoided, places deep in the outer cliffs of Korriban, where names were carved into the walls, not to honor them, but to keep them sealed. He went alone, came back stronger, and never spoke of what he brought back with him. One day, an ambitious lord challenged him in the central archives, with witnesses, with fire in his voice, accused him of cowardice, called him a fraud, said he had no bloodline, no right. He didn't answer. He didn't raise a weapon. He only stepped forward. The Lord screamed not from injury, but from something no one else could see, a force pressure that bypassed flesh and went straight to the mind. He collapsed, paralyzed, mouth open, eyes wide. He never spoke again. The Sith began using new language for him. They didn't call him Lord. That word was too small. They called him the vault, the chorus, the cage, because by now they understood. He wasn't haunted. He was inhabited. He wasn't possessed. He was complete. And the war he was fighting was not for a title, not for a throne. It was a war of names. A war to decide which voices would live again, and which would remain forgotten. And in that war, he had already won. Because his silence was not the absence of sound. It was the sound of judgment. Power never comes without cost. The Sith teach that the strong take what they are owed, that pain is a path, that fear is a weapon. But what they don't teach is what power does once it's taken root. They don't speak of the aftermath, of what's lost, of what's left behind. He stood now as something few understood, not a warrior, not a mystic, not even a lord, but a convergence, a shape built from others, a voice carried by many throats, a soul heavy with the weight of borrowed names. And the more he grew, the less of himself remained. He still remembered Korriban, the cells, the cold, the silence, but those memories felt distant now, like echoes of someone else's childhood, someone weaker, smaller, a version of him that had been buried beneath too many layers of shadow. Sometimes, in rare moments of stillness, he would try to recall his real name. He never could. Not fully. Because with every ghost he bound, something was given and something was taken. A laugh he once had. A scar he no longer remembered earning. A dream that used to visit him in sleep. Now there was only function. Only motion. Only the next relic, the next ritual, the next voice to claim. He told himself it was worth it. And it was. Because his enemies had no answer. Because the Force bent beneath his feet. Because the old lords now whispered of him not as a rival, but as a replacement. But in quiet moments, the kind he could no longer afford, he sometimes wondered if all of them lived inside him. Where did he live? There was no answer. Only more silence. He traveled to Nar Shaddaa again, to collect a holocron hidden beneath layers of corporate war. The mission was short, efficient, no lives wasted unnecessarily. But afterward, he stood on a balcony high above the city and for the first time in years paused. He watched the lights, listened to the traffic, and realized he couldn't feel the world anymore. It was there, but distant, as if his senses were tuned only to pain, to memory, to darkness. Joy didn't reach him. Beauty didn't linger. Music meant nothing. The galaxy was alive, but not to him. He had become a container, a vault, and the more complete he became, the more hollow he felt. But he did not stop, because that hollowness had purpose. The Sith who feared death became monsters, the ones who feared failure became tyrants. He feared neither. What he feared was becoming meaningless. And that fear kept him focused. He returned to Dromund Kaas. The council acknowledged him now not with words but with caution. They left him to his work. They gave him space. No one dared interrupt his rituals. No one questioned the new figures who served him in silence. Because they understood. He wasn't building a legacy. He was preparing for something else. Something larger. He studied the nature of anchors, how spirits clung to objects, to places, to living minds. He mapped Force imprints across Sith graves. He began speaking of convergence points, of nexuses, of echoes repeating across centuries. He wasn't speaking like a Sith anymore. He was speaking like something else. Because whatever Darth Nox had once been, he was no longer just one person. He was what came after. Not the shadow of death, but the shape it left behind. There are rituals the Sith do not teach, not because they are forbidden, but because they are forgotten, buried beneath conquest, lost in betrayal, whispers trapped in languages older than the Republic, knowledge locked inside bodies that were never buried, only hidden. He found the first hint by accident. A name scratched into the edge of a corrupted holocron, too old to be traced, too dangerous to be catalogued. The crystal rejected every data spike until he touched it. It opened for him, not with light, with blood. It sliced his palm on contact. The pain was sharp, shallow, but something inside the wound burned. For days afterward, he couldn't sleep, not from pain, from sound. Whispers moved through his veins, not voices, symbols, shapes, instructions written in suffering. He studied them in silence. The holocron's teachings were incomplete, fragmented through time and madness. Most Sith would have dismissed it as noise, corruption, insanity. He did not. Because he recognized the structure. It wasn't an illusion. It was a ritual. Not of sacrifice, but of invasion. Essence transfer was known, feared. Legends whispered of spirits who lived beyond death. Lords who clung to bodies, who stole flesh when their own failed. But this was different. This wasn't transfer. It was convergence. Not mind replacing mind. Mind becoming minds. A host built to house others. Not by force, by invitation. It required three things: a body broken but whole, a soul frayed but intact, and a will that did not resist the loss of identity. The ritual didn't preserve life. It consumed it and made something new. He wasn't afraid, because he had already lost himself once. And whatever remained was no longer afraid of being shared. He searched for more, hunted through the old records left behind by Zash, cross-referenced with buried fragments from Vion, Zeost, and the ruins of the Treyas core. There were mentions faint, coded of a ceremony held once, long ago, by a cult that believed the Force itself was incomplete. A heresy so deep, even the ancient Sith destroyed all records of it. But pieces survived. Because nothing truly dies in the dark, and the pieces pointed to one place. Belsavis. Not the surface. The deep vaults, where the infinite empire had buried its failures, where the Republic later built a prison atop a graveyard, where the Force pulsed not in balance, but in fracture. It wasn't just a prison for criminals. It was a vault for rituals no one dared to remember. He knew he would go there. Knew he would find the final key. But first, he needed to prepare. He carved the ritual into his skin. Not visibly. Beneath the surface, layered in blood and ink, etched between nerves, across bone. Glyphs that didn't glow, but throbbed when touched by the Force. The body had to be reshaped, not physically, but spiritually. The soul softened, the mind expanded until it stopped being a single point and became a circle. He meditated for weeks in the tombs, alone, letting the spirits inside him stretch, letting them see what he was becoming. Some resisted, but most did not, because they understood the truth. He wasn't just preparing to hold more. He was preparing to become something else entirely. And when he was ready, he stood alone before the star map. He placed his hand on the route to Belsavis. And the navicomputer didn't ask for clearance. It recognized him, not as a Sith, as a vessel, and the key was already buried inside his flesh. The planet wasn't on most star charts. Belsavis was a scar the galaxy tried to cover, a world of contradictions, ice and fire, jungle and ruin. A place where ancient civilizations came to bury their shame, where monsters were sealed, not slain, where silence was louder than memory. He didn't come with soldiers. He came alone. The Republic still operated on the surface, guarding their maximum security prison, unaware of what lay beneath, or pretending not to see it. He landed at night. No transmission, no welcome. The Force pulled him toward the southern rim, a fracture in the crust where seismic readings made no sense and scanning drones never returned. He descended on foot, deeper than the facility's records admitted existed. He passed vaults no one had opened in millennia. Cells made for species no longer remembered. Doors sealed with symbols even Sith Lords had forgotten how to read. But he could read them, because the whispers inside him did. Each sigil, each ward, each binding was familiar, not from study, from memory that wasn't his. One hallway stretched for a mile, another bent in a loop, endlessly folding back into itself. Time passed differently down here. Clocks failed, lights flickered, and in every step, the Force grew heavier like a tide crashing through stone. Then, he found it. A chamber with no designation, no doors, just a crack in the floor and breathless cold, leaking upward. He pressed his hand to the stone, and the wall opened. Not mechanically, organically, like something had been waiting for the right touch. The air inside was still, not dead, waiting. Black pillars lined the chamber in a perfect circle. In the center, an altar of bone, obsidian, and something else. Something older than metal. Atop it, a cage. Empty. Not recently, but forever. And carved into the floor, in letters too precise for any tool, were words he couldn't fully translate. Only understand. The self is the prison. The door must not close. He sat at the edge of the altar, closed his eyes, and listened. Not to the spirits he carried, to something else, deeper, older. Not a voice, a presence, vast, hollow, patient. It didn't speak with sound. It pressed into his skull like a memory long buried. And it remembered him. Not as he was, but as he would become. He felt heat behind his eyes, pressure in his chest. The ritual wasn't beginning. It was already in motion, because the moment he stepped into the room, it had started. The walls pulsed, the altar shimmered, the air grew thick with names, not spoken, felt. He saw visions, of Sith kneeling, of temples breaking, of stars collapsing inward. He saw himself standing at the center of it all. And yet, he was not alone. 1,000 hands reached through him. Not hostile, not kind, just present, watching, weighing. And in that moment, he understood the truth. This was not a ritual for power. It was a ritual for permission. A gate, and he was the key. He stood slowly, breathing steady. The voices did not scream. They welcomed him. Belsavis had not forgotten. Because Belsavis had been waiting. For someone who would not ask. For someone who would not resist. For someone who had already become a cage. He left the chamber in silence, and it closed behind him. Not like a door, like a heartbeat. There are rituals in the Sith Order meant to be witnessed. This was not one of them. What he prepared on Belsavas could not be performed before acolytes or overseers. It could not be supervised, measured, or interrupted. It required silence, darkness. A mind peeled open without hesitation. A soul widened until nothing remained that could reject what entered. He walked for hours beneath the frozen crust, following the pulse that only he could feel. Not a beacon, not a call, something heavier. As if the planet itself exhaled in slow, ancient breaths, and he was walking into its lungs. He found the chamber by instinct. No doors, no markings. Just a hollow sphere of stone carved smooth by time, or something older than time. The floor was cracked, the air stale. A faint vibration trembled beneath his feet, not mechanical, not natural. Alive, he stepped into the center and knelt. Not to show respect, to anchor himself. Because he knew what was coming. The ritual did not begin with words. It began with surrender. He opened his mind the way others opened wounds, slowly, painfully, with a steady breath that quieted everything inside him. The ghosts he carried stirred. Some resisted. Others reached for the walls. But he did not speak to them. He let the silence take shape. First came the heat. A faint burn in his spine, crawling upward like a memory of fire. Then the pressure, a weight behind his eyes, pushing inward instead of out. His heartbeat slowed, his breath shortened, the room dimmed. Or perhaps his sight did. He didn't blink. He didn't pull away. Because he had read the fragments. Because he had prepared his body. Because he knew the truth Zash never understood. This ritual wasn't powered by pain. It was powered by acceptance. The air thickened. Dust began to rise from the floor in a circle around him. Not blown upward, lifted, held, suspended. Then the voices returned. Not the ones he carried. Older ones. Thousands. Some hissed in languages lost before the Jedi existed. Some cried. Some whispered his name. Others whispered names he had never heard, but somehow recognized like distant relatives of his own thoughts. The chamber shifted. Not physically. Through him. Memories not his own flooded his senses. Battles fought on worlds long vanished. Duels in temples swallowed by sand. Deaths repeated so many times they no longer hurt. He didn't resist. He had no room left for resistance. He let them enter. The first soul tore through him like a blade dipped in ice. He gasped not from pain, but from the weight of it. A lord from the great hyperspace war, still screaming his final betrayal. The second was quieter, a priest of the old empire whose body had never been found. He slid into the boy's skull like liquid shadow. The third fought. It clawed, bit, tried to rip him apart from the inside. But the runes beneath his skin pulsed once a single ancient command, and the spirit folded into silence. More followed, dozens, hundreds. They did not break him. They filled him. Layer after layer, memory after memory, regret after regret, until he could no longer tell where their thoughts ended and his began. Time dissolved. When he finally opened his eyes, he didn't know how long he had knelt there. Minutes, hours, days. The chamber looked the same, still empty, still silent. But the silence was no longer empty. It was crowded. He stood. Slowly. The air bent around him, the way heat bends around metal. His shadow stretched in directions the light didn't allow. There were no witnesses. No audience. No master to name what he had become. But the Force knew. The dead knew. And somewhere deep beneath Belsavi's, something older than both paused, as if listening. Because the ceremony was complete, and the vessel was full, he left the vault without speaking. There was no need. The voices inside him were quiet now, not silenced, aligned, as if something larger had taken shape, something too vast to shout, too deep to name. He was not walking anymore. He was being carried. Not by feet, by momentum, by inevitability. The shuttle rose from Belsavis in silence. Stars passed the viewport, unnoticed. He didn't check coordinates. He didn't set a course. The Force moved for him now. And it moved toward Korriban. He returned at dusk, landing near the western cliffs where the wind never stopped howling. The old tombs had crumbled further, sand swallowing memory stone by stone. But one place remained untouched. A shrine carved into the base of the cliff, too small to be sacred, too old to be known. He entered it without hesitation. The air inside was cold, not from temperature, but from absence, like warmth had once existed here and never returned. He walked to the center, knelt, and waited. He didn't know how long. Time had no rhythm anymore. Eventually, something moved. Not behind him. Inside. A tremor deep in the bones of the Force, not loud, not violent, just certain. Like the universe exhaling after holding its breath for too long. And then it spoke. Not in basic, not in Sith. It used his voice. Not as mimicry. As truth. It didn't say you. It said his name. The one no one had ever spoken aloud. The one he didn't remember choosing. It echoed off the stone in a way that defied sound. It didn't reverberate, it rooted, it anchored. It made the entire chamber feel smaller, not physically, but spiritually. He wanted to speak back, but the thing inside him wasn't waiting for conversation. It was giving something. A glimpse. Not a vision of power. A memory. His own, but seen from outside. He watched himself as a child. Not on Korriban before that. Before the chains. A moment so quiet, so buried, he hadn't known it was real. He saw the fear in his eyes. The way he held still when others screamed. Not because he was brave. Because he didn't believe anyone would come if he cried. That memory faded. And another replaced it. Himself in the tombs. Bleeding. Alone, cold stone against his spine. And even then, not calling for help, not reaching out. Because some part of him believed he deserved to be forgotten. The presence showed him these things not to hurt him, but to explain him. Because the ritual hadn't changed him. It had revealed him. He wasn't the cage. He was the door. And now, something else wanted to walk through. The presence didn't ask for permission, because it was already inside. And when it moved forward, slow, careful, deliberate, it didn't overwhelm. It settled, like dust on bone. He didn't scream. He didn't resist. Because in that final moment, he understood. He had not collected these voices to gain their power. He had invited them, prepared them, not to serve him, to become him. And now the final piece had arrived. Not a lord, not a ghost, not a god, something else. Something that had waited longer than death. Something that had shaped rituals no Sith ever finished. Something that needed more than a body. It needed a soul that had already forgotten itself. And he was ready. His eyes opened. But they were not his own. He stood. But the movement wasn't singular. The Force bent, quietly, like it had recognized a name it did not give, but had always known. By the time he returned to Dromund Kaas, his name had become an echo. It was spoken in corners, behind closed doors, not with reverence, with caution. Fear had not yet taken root, but unease had. And unease is where fear begins. They called him many things. Apprentice, usurper, a weapon Zash left behind. But never by his chosen name. Never by the name he had taken for himself. Because to say it would be to acknowledge that he had earned it. And no one wanted to admit that. The Dark Council was not a place of open challenge. Not anymore. The Empire had changed. The old traditions were shadows now ceremonial, staged, hollow. Power moved in quieter ways. Manipulation, inheritance, alliance. He had none of those. No bloodline, no favor, no seat reserved for his ascent. What he had were the voices, and the silence they created. He stepped into the citadel without escort. His robes were black, trimmed in silver, unadorned by rank. His eyes glowed faintly, not with rage, but with weight. As if every step carried not one man's purpose, but many. The guards did not stop him. Not because they recognized his authority. Because something inside them told them not to. The council chamber was quiet. 12 thrones, 9 filled, 3 empty, as always though no one agreed on which. Darth Mortis was the first to speak. He didn't rise. He smiled. A tight, practiced motion, the kind that could slice throats from across a room. You have no place here, he said. The dead cannot petition the living. Darth Ravage chuckled. Darth Maul did not. But Nox did not answer. Not with words. He raised his hand, and the air changed. Not physically, spiritually. The temperature didn't drop, but everyone felt colder. The light didn't dim, but shadows deepened. The Force twisted, slowly, as if something vast and ancient had just turned its gaze toward the chamber. It wasn't a threat. It was a reminder. He did not come to ask. He came to claim. Darth Vowron leaned forward, studying him with eyes that had outlived purges and betrayals. And what exactly do you claim, my dear, whatever you are? Nox tilted his head and spoke. Only once. Not loudly. But it was enough. Because when his voice broke the silence, a dozen others echoed with it faint, just behind his own. Men, women, Sith, all speaking with him, through him as him. It lasted less than a second, but it reached every wall. And when it faded, no one laughed. Because they recognized the names. Old names. Vanished names. And those names were not supposed to return. He did not need to list his achievements. The silence after his voice did that for him. He had walked through the tombs of Korriban and returned with more than relics. He had bled into rituals no Sith dared to remember. He had bound the restless, the forgotten, the betrayed not as slaves, as parts of himself. And now, he stood before the council, as something no Sith before him had ever been. Not a man, not a master, a convergence, a council of his own. Mortis tried to object again, but no words came, because for the first time in decades, the Force itself did not move in his favor. It moved around Nox, carefully, as if aware that its balance had just shifted. And in that silence, the Empire changed. Not through battle, not through decree, through presence. The challenge came 3 days later. It wasn't unexpected. The Sith had rules, but they were never meant to prevent violence, only to shape it, to guide the knife, to keep it elegant. Darth Thanaton issued it publicly, not because he believed he could win, but because he couldn't allow the Empire to believe that Nox had already won. Thanaton was old blood. He had studied at the feet of ghosts. He believed in lineage, in the purity of power passed down from master to apprentice like scripture. And to him, Nox was a heresy, a distortion of everything the Empire stood for. He challenged not to restore honor, but to preserve illusion. They met in the circle of judgment. No guards, no spectators, just 2 Sith, face to face, surrounded by the statues of long-dead lords who had murdered each other for less. Thanaton ignited his saber first. A blade of violet fury. Classic form, elegant footwork, precision honed over decades. He moved like memory rehearsed, inherited, refined. Nox stood still. He did not ignite his saber. He didn't need to. Because the force around him was already bending. Thanaton struck, fast, brutal, controlled. But the blade stopped inches from Nox's face, caught not by a hand, but by pressure. Air shouldn't hold a lightsaber. But this wasn't air. It was weight. The weight of centuries. The ghost stirred. Not loudly, not with rage, with intent. Thanaton tried again. A flurry of strikes, now right shoulder, neck, ribs, the pattern of a practiced kill. But each time, something intervened. A pulse, a flicker, a presence. Then, the chamber changed. The air grew dry. The walls seemed to recede, not physically, but perceptually, as if space had widened to make room for something else. Nox raised his hand, only slightly, and spoke a name. Not his own. One of the voices. A lord from the Sith Reformation, lost during the Dark Wars, executed in secret, buried beneath false records. Thanaton recognized it. And in that recognition, he faltered, just for a breath. It was enough. The force rippled, a sound like glass cracking from beneath the floor. Thanaton staggered. His saber dropped to his side. He tried to summon his strength again to call the force back to him. But it didn't answer, because something else had already taken its place. Nox stepped forward. No rage in his face. No triumph. Just stillness. Thanaton raised his hand, not to strike, but to shield. And that was when lightning filled the room. Not from Nox's fingertips. From the walls. From the air. From the dead. It converged all at once, not like an attack, but like a judgment. A verdict rendered not by one man, but by the many within him. Thanaton screamed, not from pain, from clarity, because in that moment he understood something the Council hadn't yet dared to admit. This was no Sith Lord. This was a convergence, an empire's worth of spite, memory, and unfinished wrath given voice. When the light faded, Thanaton lay broken, not dead. Worse, irrelevant. He would live. But no one would follow him again. Nox didn't speak. He simply turned and walked away, not out of respect, out of certainty. The fight hadn't been a duel. It had been a demonstration. The chamber they gave him was not new. It belonged to another once, a Sith Lord whose name had been struck from the archives long before Nox arrived. Dust still lingered in the corners, not the kind that gathers from time, the kind that settles after something collapses. He sat in the chair without ceremony. No guards, no declarations, just silence. The council didn't object. They didn't congratulate him either, because they weren't sure what had just happened. Power, they understood. Fear, they respected. But this was neither. It felt like a glitch in the galaxy, something that should not have passed through the cracks, but did. He didn't speak much in those early meetings, and when he did, his voice always seemed to carry a weight the others avoided, like a memory they hadn't lived but still remembered. Even Darth Maul, ever composed, watched him with something that bordered on curiosity, as if trying to determine whether Nox was a force to work with, or a fate to prepare for. They gave him a title, not for clarity, for containment. Darth Nox. It meant nothing. A placeholder, a label to pin something that refused to be defined. But he accepted it, because he knew the truth. Names were just locks, and he had already broken every door. From his seat, he listened, watched. The other lords postured, debated, threatened in circles, like old ghosts reenacting wars they no longer had the strength to fight. But Nox didn't posture. He observed, because he knew something they didn't. He wasn't alone in that room. Not truly. The spirits followed him. Not visibly, not vocally. But he could feel them behind his eyes, listening as he listened. They had opinions. They whispered strategies, urged executions, begged for blood. But he rarely obeyed, because he understood what they didn't. He had not brought them to command him. He had brought them to learn from them. Every whisper was a fragment of history. Every urge was a relic of a different failure. He studied them the way archaeologists studied ruins, not for glory, but for warnings. And still, he could feel the pressure growing, not from the council, from the throne itself. It didn't belong to him. Not yet. It accepted him, the way a predator tolerates another until it doesn't. He could feel the weight of its former owners. Their fears, their betrayals, their mistakes. The chair wasn't just a seat. It was a grave that didn't know it was full yet. One night, alone in the chamber, he spoke to it. Not aloud. With the Force, he let it feel what he was. Not his ambition, not his intellect, his inevitability. He didn't need to conquer the council. He only needed to remain. Because time would do the rest. One by one, they would fade, fall, break under their own dogmas. And he would still be here. Not stronger, just more complete. Because they each ruled with their mind, their lightsaber, their power, but he ruled with their ghosts. And no matter how long the shadows clung to that throne, his were older and hungrier. For most Sith, the council seat was a symbol. For him, it was a mirror. A quiet place where the world finally stopped talking long enough for him to hear what had always been waiting beneath the noise. The chamber felt colder when he entered it, not from temperature, from expectation. As if the room understood more than the people inside it. He took his place. Slowly, the stone groaned. Not physically through the Force. A low, ancient vibration that hadn't stirred in years. The other lords felt it. Darth Maul turned his head. Vowron blinked once, too slowly. Mortis shifted in his throne as if adjusting to a weight he couldn't name. Nox didn't react. Because he knew what they didn't. The seat wasn't reacting to him. It was recognizing him. The ghosts inside him stirred, pressing against the edges of his thoughts like watchers leaning over a railing. Do you feel it? Do you hear it? Do you understand? He did. Because the seat was not empty stone. It was layered memory. The Force imprint of every lord who had sat there. Their ambitions, their fears, their deaths, their secrets. The throne didn't merely hold rulers, it absorbed them. And now, it was trying to understand what he was. A man. A vessel. A fracture. He placed one hand on the armrest. And the Force surged. Visions struck him not of the future, but of the chair's past. Sith rising, falling, killing each other for the right to sit here. Shadows burning holes into time. Lords whose names the Empire had scraped from its own walls, all still echoing inside the stone. But the vision didn't stop with them. It went deeper. Past the Empire. Past the Old Republic. Past the Sith themselves. Until he heard something impossible. A heartbeat. Not his. Not theirs. The chair's. A pulse in the Force so subtle he would have missed it before Belsavis, but now he could hear it clearly. It knew him. And it didn't reject him. It welcomed him the way a locked door welcomes the right key. He drew back slightly. Not in fear, in acknowledgement. Because he understood now why the Council feared him, even if they didn't have the words. He was not climbing a hierarchy. He was replacing one. Piece by piece, name by name, presence by presence. The chamber quieted as they began the session. Lords debated troop movements, diplomacy, destroyed fleets, betrayals in the Outer Rim. The usual dance. But he wasn't listening to them. He was listening to it. The seat spoke in pressure, in memory, in fragments of old emotions he didn't own but felt anyway. It showed him the weakness of the Council not in their arguments, but in their foundations. They were individuals trying to rule a collective. He was a collective sitting in the body of one. And the throne recognized that imbalance. For a moment the room blurred, the walls dimmed. The other lords looked distant, like silhouettes behind fogged glass. Because something whispered his name again. Not from within him. From beneath him. From the stone. From the imprint of a lord whose power had outlived his body. A lord who wanted to speak to him alone. The ghosts inside him went still. Listening. Waiting. Accepting. And he understood something he had never realized before. He wasn't sitting on the council seat. He was replacing it. He was becoming the memory others would answer to when they were gone. The throne didn't choose rulers. It recorded them. And now, it was recording him. Not as Darth Nox. As something larger. Something future. Something inevitable. When the session ended, the other lords stood. He didn't. He remained still. Silent. Listening to the last whisper fade into the stone. Because the seat had spoken. And he had answered. Darth Thanaton never raised his voice. He didn't have to. Every word he spoke was backed by history. Not just his own, but generations of Sith that believed power must be earned the right way through trials, through study, through lineage. Darth Nox had skipped all of that. He had become something by consuming what others left behind. To Thanaton, that wasn't strength. It was infection. And infection spreads. So he whispered, in halls, in councils, in corners where ancient stone heard more than it should. He spoke of tradition, of preservation, of fear disguised as wisdom. One by one, the old lords began to lean in, not because they liked Thanaton, but because they feared what Nox represented. A Sith who didn't climb, but swallowed of Dhamma. Thanaton told them what they needed to hear. That Nox was unstable. That the spirits inside him would tear the council apart from within. That the Force itself would revolt if such corruption was left unchallenged. He lied. But the best lies were never complete fiction. And the truth that Nox had become something the council didn't understand was terrifying enough. While the galaxy burned in its outer wars, an inner war began to bloom inside the Empire. Quiet, sharp, lethal. Spies disappeared. Old tombs were ransacked under false permits. Artifacts once sealed by order of the Dark Council began to vanish. All paths pointed to one inevitable conflict. But Nox didn't move. He didn't rally support, didn't issue threats, didn't summon fleets. He simply waited. Because he understood something they hadn't realized yet. This wasn't a war of blades. It was a war of memory. And his allies didn't live in the Senate. They lived in him. The spirits began to stir again, louder than before. He had tried to keep them quiet, had tried to be their vessel, not their servant. But now, they demanded. Not vengeance, not even survival. They demanded resolution. Thanaton's war wasn't just against Nox. It was against them. Against their legacy, their teachings, their failures rewritten as shame. And they would not be erased again. One by one, Nox visited the places they remembered. The crypts of Ziost, the charred vaults beneath Car City, the broken catacombs of Nathema, where Force energy had once been drained like blood. He wasn't gathering weapons. He was awakening echoes. Some were just fragments, voices without identity, raw rage without structure. Others remembered their names. And they whispered back. They didn't speak in language. They spoke in feeling, in direction, in weight. Until Nox felt the galaxy tilt. Until even his own thoughts were no longer singular. He wasn't alone anymore. He had never been. But now, he didn't resist it. He let them rise. And they showed him what Thanaton feared most. That truth didn't need belief to be dangerous. It only needed to be heard. The shadows of the Empire began to shift. Lords who had once mocked him grew silent. Some defected. Some simply disappeared, not because they were killed, but because they remembered something they had tried to forget. That the dark side was not safe. That it didn't reward purity. It rewarded result. And Nox was result incarnate. By the time Thanaton realized his movement had slowed, it was already decayed. His allies no longer moved against Nox. They moved around him, avoided his path, whispered prayers they didn't believe in. Because no one wanted to be the next to vanish into the Force without explanation. And still, Nox said nothing. Because silence was louder when you carried the dead with you. He didn't remember when the voices stopped feeling separate. There was a time early in his rise when each spirit had its own cadence, its own pressure, its own presence inside his mind. Some whispered sharply, some murmured like distant thunder, some clawed. Some begged, some recited fragments of teachings that had not been spoken aloud in 1,000 years. Now, they moved together. not unified, aligned. He walked through the lower halls of the sphere of ancient knowledge, and the Force shifted in a way the acolytes couldn't understand. They bowed without thinking. Not to him, to the weight behind him, the same way someone bows when passing a graveyard that feels too awake. He didn't correct them. The spirits stirred with each step, not agitated, prepared. Thanaton's war had shaken something loose inside him, a tension he hadn't noticed, a thread pulled too tightly for too long. The ghosts felt it too. He sensed it in the way they pressed at the edge of his thoughts, like soldiers adjusting their weapons before a battle not yet named. He entered the meditation chamber. Small, circular, silent. He sat, closed his eyes, and let the event horizon inside him widen. For a moment, he felt nothing. Nothing except the cold stone beneath his palms. Then the first voice emerged, not spoken, but shaped. He moves against you. A second followed, older, rougher. He fears what you reveal by existing. A third, soft, almost gentle. He wants the Empire to stay buried in its own dust. He breathed out. Slow, measured. The spirits weren't warning him. They were remembering. He saw flashes of their pasts, Thanaton's predecessors, rivals, enemies, lords who had believed, as Thanaton did, that tradition was more important than truth. That the Sith Order should remain frozen in its old forms, even if those forms were broken. The ghosts had seen this before, fought it before, died because of it before. That was why they pushed him now. Not to destroy Thanaton, to prevent a cycle from repeating. He opened himself further, and the chamber changed. Not visually. Weight changed. Air changed. The Force thickened, not with darkness, but with memory. Like the room had filled with people he couldn't see but could feel pressing close, shoulder to shoulder, surrounding him. He didn't resist. He sank into it. Images flooded his mind again, not visions of the future, but reconstructions of the past, a duel in a forgotten tomb, a ritual interrupted by betrayal, a council meeting drowned in screams. Ghosts didn't forget what the living wanted buried. And now those memories belonged to him. He saw Thanaton studying ancient scrolls, twisting them to justify his hate. He saw the fear in the older lord's eyes. He saw the path this war would take if he didn't act. He spoke quietly, not to the room, but to them. "What do you want me to do?" Silence. Then, a path forward. A force pressed gently against his spine. A direction. Not physical. Purpose. He understood. The fight with Thanaton wasn't for a throne or a title. It was for meaning. For whether the Sith would continue pretending that power was heritage, or accept that power was hunger, evolution, change. Thanaton wanted the Sith to be a museum. Nox carried enough ghosts to know what museums become. Graves for ideas. He stood. The pressure inside him shifted like 1,000 figures rising with him, ready, watching through his eyes. He did not walk out of the chamber alone. He couldn't anymore. Because the ghosts didn't just ride within him. They walked with him. Forward. Into war. The Temple of Dark Knowledge had seen thousands of duels. But none like this. It began with silence. Not the quiet of peace, but the kind that comes before something sacred is broken. The floor was carved obsidian, the walls etched with words from before the great hyperspace war. At the far end stood Thanaton, draped in ceremonial armor not to protect himself, but to remind everyone watching that he believed he was already victorious. He didn't see an opponent. He saw a mistake, a sickness to be cut out in front of the Empire. Nox entered alone. No guards, no students, no witnesses, except the ones who had been waiting since before his birth, the ones no one else could see. The force around him shimmered, not with power, but with pressure. Like the air knew this wasn't going to be a duel. It was going to be a reckoning. Thanaton raised his voice for the first time in years. He called Nox a thief, a fraud, a parasite wearing a crown of bones. He said the council had been weak to allow it, that the Sith would rot from within if something wasn't done. Nox said nothing, not because he didn't have words, because the time for them had passed. Thanaton struck first. Lightning lanced across the temple, cracking stone, illuminating every statue, every carving of ancient Sith Lords long forgotten. But it didn't reach Nox. The spirits around him, hundreds now, pushed back in unison. Not as shields, as memories. Thanaton's power clashed not with Nox's strength, but with the weight of all the pain, betrayal, failure, and rage carried inside him. The storm collapsed inward. The council members who had gathered to witness began to back away, unsure whether to intervene or pray. The second exchange shattered the floor. Nox moved like a shadow peeling off the wall. Not fast, not flashy, just final. His blade was red, Thanaton's was violet. Their clash sent sparks into the rafters. But it wasn't the blades that mattered. It was what followed. Each time Nox swung, a voice spoke through him. A different voice. An older voice. A scream from an era Thanaton thought buried. The temple began to echo with sounds that didn't belong in this time. Words in dialects that hadn't been spoken in centuries. Names that hadn't been uttered since the days of Marka Ragnos. It was no longer a duel. It was a haunting. Thanaton faltered. He struck again, this time with both hands, not a Sith Lord's precision, but a desperate man's rage. The force cracked the walls. One of the statues split down the middle. Nox didn't flinch. He stepped forward. One step, then another, and the ghosts followed. Thanaton saw them now. Not fully, just enough. Faces forming in the corners of his vision. Shadows crawling behind Nox's shoulders. He tried to scream a command to stop the duel, to end the ritual. But he had made a fatal mistake. He had brought them here. Publicly, legally, formally. This wasn't murder. It was judgment. And the Sith watched. Some turned away. Others watched everything. Because they knew this wasn't about who was stronger. It was about who the Force had already chosen. Thanaton's final strike never landed. His body dropped to one knee. Not from pain. From pressure. He looked up, eyes wide, lips trembling. You are not one man. Nox lowered his saber and spoke the only words that mattered. I never was. The spirits surged. Thanaton collapsed. The duel was over. The temple would never feel the same again. Because from that day forward, it remembered what fear sounded like. The duel ended, but the echoes stayed. Some said the chamber still held the scent of scorched stone. Others said the shadows moved differently now, slower, as if mourning. The truth was simpler and far more disturbing. Something had changed. Not in the temple, in the Sith. Thanaton was dead. But his ideas weren't. They drifted through the halls like smoke that refused to clear the belief that tradition was strength, that knowledge had limits, that the Sith should remain loyal to the shape they had worn for centuries. His allies were silent now, yes, but not gone. And Nox knew it. He didn't celebrate. He didn't gloat. He simply left the chamber the way he had entered it alone, with more than himself inside. The other council members gave him space, out of respect, or out of fear, or both. They didn't speak his name loudly. They spoke it carefully, like it might answer back. Because Darth Nox wasn't a man anymore. He was an archive of pain, a walking history of Sith failure, rewritten and recited every time someone dared oppose him. He had no ideology, no legacy to protect, just presence, just momentum. And that terrified them. He returned to his own chambers, deep, quiet, lit only by the pulse of ancient runes. He sat where the light couldn't reach him, and listened. The ghosts were quiet, not gone, just satisfied. For now, he looked at his reflection in the blade's surface, not at his face, at what wasn't there. The eyes that stared back weren't his anymore, not completely. They belonged to dozens, maybe more. He didn't count them. He couldn't. He had stopped trying to separate himself from them, stopped asking where they ended and he began, because the answer was always the same. There was no line. There never had been. He remembered his first weeks at the academy, how they mocked him, beat him, ignored him, how the overseers saw him as a footnote too quiet to be dangerous, too broken to be useful. He remembered the feeling of rising, not out of anger, but out of necessity, like breathing, like bleeding. He had become a Sith the way others became corpses. Unwillingly, unconsciously, permanently. Now, he was on the Dark Council. But it didn't feel like power. It felt like containment. He didn't command fleets. He contained history. He didn't win battles. He survived legacies. That was his strength and his curse. The others didn't understand it. Not truly. They saw what he had done to Thanaton and believed it was strategy. Cold calculation. They didn't see the toll. The hollowing. The way every spirit dragged him further from himself. How he could no longer recall the sound of his own voice unaccompanied by others. How even his thoughts arrived now in echoes. He wasn't angry. He wasn't even tired. He was full. Too full. The walls around him trembled. Not physically, through the Force. The temple knew what he had become. And it was afraid. Not because he would destroy it, but because one day he might become it. A monument, a memory, another name whispered by acolytes who never truly understood who he was, or what he carried. He looked down at his hand, opened his fingers. No scars, no blood. But he felt every wound ever inflicted on him. Every blade, every betrayal, every whisper behind his back. He had carried them all here. To this room. To this chair. To this quiet. And now there was only the next name. The next shadow. The next enemy who thought they could kill a man, without realizing they were fighting 1,000 souls. He rose. The air bent slightly around him. And without a word, Darth Nox disappeared into the corridors. But the silence he left behind was louder than any scream. The galaxy called him Darth Nox, but that name was only part of him. It echoed through war councils and Sith archives, A title spoken with either reverence or fear, and always from a distance. But to the few who had seen him up close, the name felt wrong. It was too quiet, too small. It didn't capture what he had become. Because Darth Nox did not speak alone anymore. Every command, every decision, every breath came with a weight behind it, the pressure of voices he couldn't silence. Spirits bound by rituals older than most civilizations. Lords of the past, tethered to his soul like chains to a prisoner. And yet he wore them like a crown. Not with pride, with inevitability. There was no ceremony when he claimed the seat on the Dark Council. No applause, no acknowledgement from the stars. Just a quiet shift in the Force, as if reality itself had reluctantly accepted that something new had entered the structure of power. Something unnatural. He sat where only masters were allowed. But he did not feel like a master. He felt like a vessel. And sometimes, when the chambers were still and the torches low, he could hear them again. The ones he had defeated. The ones he had absorbed, not screaming. Whispering. Not in defiance. In hunger. He had won every battle. Crushed every rival. And yet, as the council bowed their heads, he wondered if the man beneath the voices had ever truly spoken at all. Some Sith feared death. Others feared defeat. Darth Nox feared forgetting who he was. At first, it was subtle, a hesitation before speaking, a moment of silence where clarity used to live. His thoughts were no longer clean lines. They blurred, overlapped, became stained by memories that were not his. Names he had never known surfaced in his dreams. Planets he had never seen appeared behind his eyes. He was slipping. Not in power. In self. Each spirit he had bound was meant to serve. But they had lived full lives before him, lives of ambition, rage, betrayal. And none of them had forgotten. Their histories had weight. And now, that weight pressed down on his mind every time he reached for his own past. He tried to remember his birth name once. It didn't come. Instead, he remembered dying on Zyast. He remembered commanding legions on Malachor V. He remembered being betrayed by apprentices he'd never trained. But none of those memories were his. At least, he didn't think they were. On Dromund Kos, they said he had grown cold, that he no longer looked people in the eye, that he spoke with pauses now as if someone else was answering first. His enemies thought it was strategy, that he was simply measuring their worth. They were wrong. He was measuring reality, trying to decide which voice belonged to him, and which ones never had. The Dark Council chamber was never truly silent. Most Sith believed the faint hum in the air came from old machinery or the distant storm outside. But Darth Nox knew better. He heard something deeper, a pulse hidden beneath the stone, echoing softly between the walls. It grew louder when he sat on his throne. Not physically, through the Force. It was the same feeling he'd sensed on Belsavis, the same hollow breath that moved through abandoned tombs, a presence older than the Empire, older than the ancestors of the Sith themselves. And now, it was watching him, feeding on him. He felt it every time the ghosts inside him stirred, when their whispers sharpened, when their hunger pressed against his thoughts like claws dragging along glass. They wanted more. Not power, not blood. Space, room to grow. Room to breathe inside him. And he knew what that meant. If he didn't keep control, if even one voice swelled louder than the rest, the balance inside him would fracture. The spirits would tear their way out, or tear him apart from within. He sat perfectly still as council members debated war, strategy, and politics. Their voices drifted around him like dust in a forgotten vault. He barely heard them. He was listening to something else. A rhythm under his skin. A hunger beneath the throne. Not his own. Something waiting for the moment he finally slipped and lost himself completely. He no longer dreamed in images. Only voices. Sometimes they argued, sometimes they screamed, but most often they just spoke, calmly, softly, like old friends sitting in the dark, reminding each other who they used to be. Names, titles, regrets, and every night Darth Nox listened, because part of him still wanted to understand them, even as they pulled him further from himself. He tried to anchor his thoughts in reality. He studied holocrons, read reports, issued commands. He walked the halls of power with precision. But there were moments, tiny cracks in the day where he forgot where he was, or when, or why. And each time, the return felt slower, more distant. One day, he stood before his reflection and did not recognize the face looking back. It wore his features, his armor, his expression. But behind the eyes, something shifted. Something watched. He realized then, the prison he had built was no longer around the spirits. It was around him. He had sealed himself inside a fortress of memory, a mind shared by 1,000 voices, a will sharpened by torment and ambition. And somewhere within it, the man who had once clawed his way from the shadows of Korriban now drifted quietly, unheard. The galaxy still called him Darth Nox. But titles meant nothing now. He had become something else. Not one Sith, not many, but a symphony of silence, and a mind that had finally fractured. He ruled nothing, no empire, no armies, no bloodline, and yet his presence lingered. After the fall of Darth Thanaton, after the rituals, the spirits, the battles, there was only quiet. No declaration, no crowning, no monument. Darth Nox simply stepped away, and the galaxy did not understand why. Some believed it was a trick that he vanished to prepare a greater weapon or escape death. But those who served beside him, those who heard the whispers when he entered a room, they understood. He was full, too full. Power had never been his goal. He didn't crave thrones or legions. He wanted what was stolen from him long ago: identity, voice, control. But when he seized it, when he absorbed the last screaming soul, he discovered a truth darker than the rituals had warned. He no longer remembered which breath was his. Dromund Kaas fell quiet in his absence. The Dark Council filled his seat with silence. No one claimed his territory. No one wore his mark, because to do so meant inviting something back. There were rumors of a ship, unregistered, that left Kaas City days later. No pilot, no crew, just a quiet hum and faint, overlapping whispers in the static. The Sith archives recorded nothing further. No death certificate, no confirmed sighting, just a name removed from council rolls, and a warning whispered in the halls. Do not seek him. Do not call to him. Do not remember him. But memory does not forget. Some say he died in a forgotten tomb, surrounded by shadows that were once his. Others believe he simply walked away from the galaxy, into the deep. But one fact remains. The Force never went quiet again. There are places where the Force feels wrong. Jedi avoid them, Sith deny them. But the old ones, the ones who remember what the Force used to feel like, they know. They speak of temples that breathe when no wind moves, holocrons that flicker without being touched, statues whose mouths open in the dark, and always the same thing. A voice that is not a voice. Too many, too layered, too old. It doesn't speak in words. It pours into the mind like smoke. It shows faces the listener never knew. It shows pain the listener never felt. And when it stops, it leaves something behind. Guilt, hunger, a memory that doesn't belong to them. These places are scattered across the stars. On SWTOR, where the ground cracked after the rituals ended. On Yavin 4, where new Sith apprentices scream in their sleep. Even on Korriban, deep in the tombs that were once sealed where torchlight bends and shadows linger too long. Some believe the echoes are pieces of the past, trauma left behind by those who died in anger. But a few scholars exiled, discredited, hunted whisper a different truth. The voices are not dead. They are still inside something. Still reaching. Still trying to be heard. And when the Force trembles for no reason, when the temperature shifts without wind, when the stars seem to blink slower than before, those who know what to listen for hear it. 1,000 breaths, exhaling at once. They don't come from the world. They come from within it. There are temples that no longer appear on charts. Not because they were lost, but because someone erased them. Deep in the jungles of Dexon, beneath the sand-worn ruins of Voss, in sealed catacombs far below Belsavis, there are doorways carved in forgotten dialects. Doorways that were never meant to open again. And yet, sometimes, they do. Expeditions sent by Sith warlords vanish. Republic scouts go silent. Archaeologists return unable to speak, or weep, or sleep. Some come back, carrying voices that weren't theirs. Inside these ruins, nothing is stable. Torches burn blue, gravity shifts. Reflections look back a second too long. And in every corridor, every broken chamber, the same sigil appears not on walls, but in the air. A trace of someone who was never supposed to be remembered. Darth Nox. But the temples don't speak his name, they echo it, like breath trapped in stone. Some believe the rituals left residue, that Nox's powers stained the walls with memory. But others, the few who return unharmed, describe something else. Awareness. Not like a ghost, not like a presence. Like a mind. A fractured one. They describe questions without words, hunger without appetite, and most of all, recognition. As if the temples are not just watching, they are remembering. Not just what happened, but who you are. And once you've entered, they do not forget you. These temples aren't haunted. They're listening, waiting, not for the return of a Sith, but for the return of the only one they obeyed. The galaxy remembers tyrants, emperors, betrayers, martyrs. But it does not remember Darth Nox. Not truly. There are no statues, no chronicles, no tomb. His name is mentioned only in passing, if at all, by those who survived his rise. And even they struggle to recall his face, or how he spoke, or when exactly he disappeared. As if the Force itself chose to forget. But forgetting is not the same as silence. In the far reaches of wild space, beyond the edges of mapped hyperspace lanes, strange patterns appear. Ships flicker in and out of scanners. Comm static repeats old Sith mantras. Unmarked satellites begin transmitting coordinates, all pointing to the same empty region of space. And beneath it all voices. Some layered, some alone, all fractured. They speak in memory, in warnings, in grief, Some sound like children, others like Sith Lords long thought dead, but all carry the same feeling, a cry held in too long, a scream that never finished. There is no proof Nox survived. No body, no final battle, no betrayal. Just absence. But those who believe, the ones who study Force anomalies, who map tremors no Jedi can explain, they know the truth. He became what the ritual promised. Not immortal, untraceable. He is not bound by flesh, not buried in the earth. He is scattered across temples, across whispers, across the Force itself. Not a man, not a legend, a wound. And when that wound opens again, the galaxy will not face a Sith Lord. It will face 1,000 voices, all speaking as one.